Under the cool night sky in a quiet suburb of Lima, Peru, police flashlights cut through the darkness. Neighbors gather at a distance as officers carefully dig into a patch of freshly disturbed earth behind a modest home. A sharp, sickly odor hangs in the air. Then, the dull thud of a shovel striking something solid. Moments later, a blue plastic sheet emerges from the shallow grave. Inside are the remains of a woman, her body wrapped tightly in tarpaulin. The site is eerily still as investigators confirm the unthinkable. The missing tourist they've been searching for has been found. What was meant to be a dream vacation has ended in a deeply disturbing twist. This is the story of 37-year-old Karla Godoy and how one romantic trip to Peru ended in a horrific crime. Karla Zelaya Godoy was by all accounts a joyful, caring woman. Originally from Honduras, Karla had built a life for herself in London, England. She was a naturalized Spanish citizen, a loving mother to an 8-year-old daughter, and someone who brought sunshine into everyone's life with her carefree spirit and loving nature, as her employer later fondly described. Her heart brimmed with love for her family, especially for her young daughter, who was being cared for by her ex-husband in Spain. In 2021, while working at a cleaning company in Dartford, a town in Kent, southeast of London, Karla met a man named Jorge Alfredo Minaya Garay, known simply as Jorge Garay. Jorge was 46, originally from Peru, and he worked alongside Karla. What began as an office camaraderie blossomed into a romance. By April 2021, only months after meeting, Karla and Jorge had moved in together in Dartford, sharing a small rented flat and blending their lives. Karla's brother Eric later recounted that the couple seemed happy and in love. He even thought Jorge was a nice person and was pleased his sister had found someone in London. By late summer 2022, after over a year of dating, Karla and Jorge planned an exciting trip. Jorge was eager to introduce Karla to his homeland of Peru, where much of his family still lived. For Karla, it was the chance of a lifetime. She would get to see the famous mountains of Cusco and the ancient citadel of Machu Picchu, and celebrate her birthday abroad with the man she loved. The trip was also an opportunity for Karla to meet Jorge's relatives, a sign that their relationship was serious and moving forward. With her daughter safe with family in Spain and regular phone calls scheduled to check in, Karla embarked on this romantic getaway full of optimism and excitement. On September 12th, 2022, the couple set off. They left the UK and flew first to Spain, likely a brief stopover and a chance for Karla to see some of her relatives in Madrid. While in Spain, Karla spoke with her aunt, sharing some worries on her mind. Her ex-partner, the father of her daughter, had been making unsettling threats. He had warned he might try to take away their 10-year-old daughter. This weighed heavily on Karla, and she vented her distress to her aunt. Jorge knew about these tensions with Karla's ex and her fears of losing her child. According to what prosecutors later revealed, this issue had caused arguments between Karla and Jorge even before their trip. Jorge disliked the fact that Karla was in frequent contact with her daughter and ex, and it made him jealous. Still, at this point, the couple pushed those worries aside to enjoy their vacation. They spent a few days in Spain, then on September 15th, they boarded a flight from Madrid to Lima, Peru. For Karla, arriving in Peru was a dream come true. She was thousands of miles from home, eager to explore a new country and bond with Jorge's family. In Lima, Jorge's relatives welcomed her warmly. They stayed at the home of Jorge's family in Caraballo, a district on the northern outskirts of Lima where his grandmother lived. Karla kept in close touch with her own family throughout the trip, often messaging or calling to share her adventures. She even posted snapshots to a family WhatsApp group, showing off the beautiful sights she was seeing. In one photo shared to the group, Karla is smiling with the lush green peaks of Machu Picchu behind her. Indeed, on September 21st, Karla and Jorge had travelled to Cusco, and spent the day exploring the majestic Inca citadel together, an experience Karla excitedly documented. It was the pinnacle of their sightseeing tour. They arrived at the Inca city on September 21st. They toured the site and took photos that the victim shared with her relatives via WhatsApp, one news report noted. Those photos show Karla beaming, appearing utterly happy in the company of her partner. After a few days soaking in Peru's cultural treasures, the couple returned to Lima to wind down their trip. It was now late September. Karla had a return flight booked to Spain, where she planned to reunite with her daughter, who was eagerly waiting for her mum's return. The plan, Karla told her family, was that she would fly from Lima back to Spain on September 24th. Jorge's plans were a bit more flexible. As far as anyone knew, he might stay a little longer in Peru to visit, or possibly accompany Karla partway. They had left their Dartford flat in England temporarily and expected to resume their lives there after the vacation. On the afternoon of September 22nd, 2022, Karla checked in with her family as usual, this time for what would unknowingly be the last time. She called her mother by phone. Karla's voice was upbeat and animated. She mentioned that she was in a taxi with Jorge, about to visit his mother's house in Lima. In fact, they were heading to Caraballo to see Jorge's relatives, likely the same place they were staying. Karla sounded happy, even enthusiastic about meeting her boyfriend's family, her brother Eric later said. During that call, Karla also confirmed her travel plans. She reminded her mother that tomorrow, September 23rd, she would be flying to Spain. Her mother wished her safe travels. Karla promised to call again soon. That call on the 22nd was the final contact anyone in Karla's family would ever have with her. The next day, September 23rd, came and went with an eerie silence from Karla. She did not show up for her flight to Spain. When her loved ones tried to reach her cell phone, there was no answer. Text messages went unread. Initially, they told themselves there might be a simple explanation. Perhaps Karla's phone battery died, or she had decided to extend her stay a bit longer. But as hours turned into a full day of no communication, worry set in like a dark cloud. This was entirely unlike Karla, who was usually in constant contact. Her family's concern escalated rapidly. By September 24th, they knew something was wrong. Karla's family began a frantic search for answers. From their homes in Honduras and Spain, they reached out across international lines to try and locate her. First, they contacted authorities in Spain, thinking Karla might have somehow traveled there without informing them, but Spanish police had no record of her arrival. Next, they alerted authorities in Peru that Karla was missing. In these early days of uncertainty, even Karla's brother Eric struggled to piece together what might have happened. He initially feared that both Karla and Jorge could have been victims of foul play, perhaps kidnapped while traveling in Peru. This wasn't an outrageous assumption. Lima is a large city, and tourists can be targets for crime. In fact, when Eric Zelaya formally reported his sister missing at the end of September, he managed the hypothesis of a possible kidnapping in Lima after the couple returned from their Cusco tour. With his sister's sudden disappearance, Eric's mind grasped at any possibility, however grim, that could explain why Karla had vanished. At first, the focus was on finding Karla safe and sound. Through Honduran diplomatic channels and local contacts, the family pleaded for help in Peru. By September 30th, posters and social media messages were circulating, describing Karla and asking for any information on the missing Honduran Spanish tourist. All the while, there was one person conspicuously absent from the search efforts: Jorge Garay, Karla's boyfriend and travel companion. Back in London, friends of Karla grew uneasy. One close friend, who knew the couple well, tried reaching out to Jorge online, but he did not respond to calls or messages. As the days passed with no word, the friend took to social media to raise alarm. She wrote that Jorge had unexpectedly returned to the UK without Karla, quietly cleared out the apartment they shared, and then disappeared without telling anyone. The friend's post essentially accused Jorge of knowing more than he was saying. Why else would he abruptly take his things and leave to an unknown destination right after Karla went missing? Indeed, by the start of October 2022, disturbing facts were surfacing. Karla's family managed to check immigration records in Peru and found that neither Karla nor Jorge had officially departed the country in late September, as planned. That meant Karla definitely hadn't flown out on the 23rd. She was still, at least as of that date, in Peru. They soon discovered something even more startling. Jorge did leave Peru on October 1st. Peruvian immigration logs showed that he travelled over the border into Chile and then caught a flight back to London, arriving in the UK on October 4th. Karla, however, was not with him. Armed with this evidence, Karla's brother Eric spoke to Peruvian media, revealing what he knew. He has left Peru. He arrived in London. He took all the clothes from the apartment where he lived with my sister. There's nothing there of my sister's anymore. This revelation was chilling. It painted a picture of a man fleeing, covering his tracks by emptying the home he and Karla shared. The realization dawned on Karla's family that Jorge was not another victim. He was very likely the perpetrator, or at least had intimate knowledge of Karla's fate. Peruvian authorities treated the case with increasing urgency. On October 3rd, 11 days since Karla had last been heard from, the country's specialized division of kidnapping investigation took charge of the file. Given the initial suspicion of abduction, this unit's involvement made sense. Investigators began gathering all possible leads. They interviewed people who had seen the couple, checked hotel records from Cusco, and visited Jorge's relatives in Lima. Notably, police spoke with Jorge's grandmother in Caraballo, at whose house the couple had been staying. The elderly woman confirmed that Jorge had visited her around the time Karla disappeared, but he'd already left Peru and hadn't said where he was going. It appears she too was unaware of Karla's whereabouts, or at least claimed to be. One crucial clue was Jorge's abrupt departure. Peruvian police obtained the official travel records for Jorge Garay. The documents showed the exact dates of his movements. He left Peru on October 1st, then continued on to London. This timeline aligned perfectly with Karla's disappearance. It was as if Jorge had waited more than a week after Karla was last seen, and then decided to bolt. The fact that he fled the country while Karla was missing cast him in a deeply suspicious light. By this point, Peruvian investigators considered Jorge the prime suspect, albeit one who was now 6,000 miles away, out of their immediate reach. News of the case began to appear in Peruvian media. Headlines described a Honduran tourist missing in Peru, boyfriend suspected. Some reports even suggested Karla might have been kidnapped and murdered by her boyfriend, based on the family's statements and the developing evidence. The public was gripped by the story. A foreign woman comes to Peru on vacation and vanishes, and the man she was with has suddenly left the country. It was a mystery and a potential crime that people followed with growing outrage and concern, especially given Peru's ongoing struggle with domestic violence and femicides. In fact, Peru has faced a serious epidemic of violence against women. In 2022 alone, authorities recorded 147 femicides, gender-motivated killings of women, across the country, roughly 3 per week. Many of these crimes involve women killed by their intimate partners, a grim statistic that loomed in the background of Karla's case. Peru's legal system treats femicide as a distinct crime often punishable by life in prison, reflecting the country's resolve to combat domestic violence. As the clues increasingly pointed to an instance of femicide, allegedly at the hands of a Peruvian man, the case struck a national nerve. Media outlets labelled Karla's disappearance and suspected killing as yet another feminicidio, with the twist that this time the accused had fled abroad. By the second week of October 2022, 2 parallel investigations were underway. Peruvian police were pursuing leads in Lima, while law enforcement in the UK, specifically the Kent police, responsible for Dartford, had opened their own inquiry. Karla's worried relatives had reached out to British authorities as early as late September, filing a missing person report in Kent since Karla was a UK resident. Now, with evidence of a possible murder on Peruvian soil, British detectives coordinated closely with their Peruvian counterparts. They faced an unusual situation. The suspect was a UK resident back on British turf, but the crime occurred in another country. Under normal circumstances, Peru would issue an international warrant and seek extradition of the suspect to stand trial there. And in early October, Peruvian prosecutors were indeed contemplating issuing an arrest warrant and Interpol red notice for Jorge. However, events were about to take a dramatic turn that would change the course of the investigation and make legal history in the process. On October 12th, 2022, 20 days after Karla had vanished, the dam finally broke. That day, friends and family of Karla were still desperately searching, clinging to hope but fearing the worst. Jorge, who had been evading contact, unexpectedly reached out. In a telephone call that can only be described as chilling and confessional, Jorge Godoy told Karla's brother the horrific truth. It was evening in Honduras when Eric Zelaya's phone rang. To his shock, it was Jorge on the line from England. Jorge's voice was quivering, and he sounded as if he was in anguish. Speaking in Spanish, Jorge began to spill out a series of guilt-ridden statements. "It hurts so much. I'm sorry for everything that happened. I don't know what happened. I killed her. I feel very bad." These were the words of a man in torment, an admission of murder. Eric could barely process it. The boyfriend he once trusted was now confessing to killing his beloved sister. Eric steeled himself and did what any determined brother would do. He pressed for answers. Fighting through his own emotions, Eric begged Jorge to tell him where Karla was. "Just tell me where she is so we can find her body. Please tell me where," he pleaded. Jorge, in between sobs and ramblings about wanting to end his own life, finally gave a crucial piece of information. "I put her in such and such place. It's a property where my grandmother lives." Jorge was indicating that Karla's body was hidden at his grandmother's house, the family property in Caraballo, Lima, where they had stayed. He mentioned, "I called the police and have told them where I put her," according to another account of his confession, suggesting that either during this call or shortly after, he also relayed the location directly to authorities in Peru. Jorge's confession was deeply disturbing, but it was the breakthrough everyone had been waiting for. On that same night, October 12th, as soon as the information was passed to them, Peruvian police mobilized to the address in Caraballo that Jorge had identified. Officers from the homicide division rushed to the scene with forensic experts, and even a local prosecutor to oversee the operation. It was already dark when they arrived at the little house in Caraballo, but they wasted no time securing the backyard and beginning the search. The investigators followed the directions from the phone call, a specific spot in the garden behind the house. It didn't take long for them to notice signs of disturbed soil in the yard. Under the beam of lanterns and portable floodlights, the team started digging. What they uncovered confirmed everyone's worst fears. Several inches beneath the dirt, shrouded in a blue plastic tarp, were human remains. Karla had been found. She was no longer a missing person. She was now evidence in a murder case. The recovery of Karla's body was a laborious and heart-wrenching process. The grave was shallow, but rigor and decomposition had set in, complicating the extraction. It reportedly took over 10 hours for authorities to carefully unearth and retrieve her remains from the pit. During the excavation, a foul odor permeated the air. Neighbors later remarked they had noticed a terrible smell for days, but hadn't been sure where it came from. Karla's body, once uncovered, was found in a state that told a tale of violence. A ligature, a cord or rope, was still present, wrapped twice around her neck, and her hands were bound. Peruvian forensic investigators noted that she showed signs of having been severely beaten and even sexually assaulted before her death. The crime scene was nothing short of horrific. Karla's life had been brutally cut short in the very place she had felt safe, the home of her partner's family. By the time dawn broke on October 13th, the authorities had transported Karla's body to the central morgue of Lima for an autopsy and official identification. Fingerprint records quickly confirmed that the remains were indeed Karla Godoy. An initial examination by Peruvian medical examiners determined the cause of death to be strangulation. The violence she suffered, especially the binding of her neck and wrists, painted a chilling picture of her final moments, one starkly at odds with the self-defense story Jorge had hinted at. News of the discovery broke in Peru that day. Outlets reported the grim update. Cadaver of Honduran tourist found in Caraballo. The sense of grief and outrage was palpable. Karla's family in Honduras and Spain were notified, plunging them into heartbreak. They had held on to hope that perhaps she might be found alive, but now those hopes were shattered. Eric later said that in that moment, "When I lost my sister, I lost a part of me." Their worst nightmare was confirmed, but at least now they knew what had happened and could begin seeking justice. For Jorge Garay, there was no turning back. He had confessed, whether out of guilt or fear or both, and the evidence of his crime was literally unearthed. Importantly, he had made his confession while on British soil and provided crucial details to investigators. This fact opened the door for British authorities to take immediate action. Under UK law, simply confessing to a crime isn't enough for prosecution, but combined with the body being found and forensic evidence, it gave them a strong basis to move forward. They wouldn't wait for an extradition request from Peru. Instead, Kent police, who had been working with the information shared by the family and Peruvian officials, swiftly obtained an arrest warrant for Jorge in the UK. On October 14th, 2022, just 2 days after the confession, police tracked down Jorge in London and arrested him on suspicion of murder. The arrest reportedly took place in the early morning hours in the capital. It's unclear exactly where Jorge was hiding out. He had left his Dartford flat, so he may have been staying with friends or laying low elsewhere in the city. But the authorities found him and placed him in custody. 2 days later, on October 16th, the Crown Prosecution Service formally charged Jorge Garay with the murder of Karla Godoy. He was brought before a magistrate's court, initially Folkestone Magistrates Court in Kent, that very next day, where the basic details of the case were read out. Jorge spoke only to confirm his name, age, and address through a Spanish interpreter. He did not enter any plea at that stage. The case was swiftly sent up to the Crown Court for trial due to its seriousness. The magistrate denied bail, as is typical in such severe charges, so Jorge was remanded in custody to await trial. Thus, within a span of a week, Karla's fate had been discovered, and the man responsible was behind bars. But this was only the beginning of a complex journey through the justice system, one that would involve 2 countries and test the reach of the law. In the immediate aftermath of Jorge's arrest, a question loomed. Where would he face justice? Karla's murder had occurred on Peruvian soil, so ordinarily Peru would have primary jurisdiction. Typically, in such cases, the UK would extradite the suspect to Peru to be tried there. However, this situation had a unique twist. A new piece of British legislation meant that the UK could choose to prosecute the case at home, even though the crime happened abroad, because it was related to domestic abuse. This law was Section 72 of the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, which had come into effect not long before. It gives courts in England and Wales jurisdiction to try certain violent offences committed overseas if the accused is a UK resident and the victim is their partner or ex-partner. Essentially, it closed a loophole that had previously allowed abusers to escape justice by luring victims abroad. Under this law, the nationality of the victim doesn't matter. What matters is the relationship and the residency of the perpetrator. In the past, UK courts could only try a murder from abroad if the victim was a British national. Karla was Honduran Spanish, not British. But because of the new act, British authorities now had the power to prosecute Jorge for Karla's murder as a form of domestic homicide. It was a highly unusual and precedent-setting move. In fact, police said it was the first time this law would be used in a UK murder case. The Crown Prosecution Service debated the best course. There was strong evidence on hand, Jorge's confession, forensic proof of murder, etc. And they had the suspect in custody in the UK. If they sent him to Peru, it could take time, and he might contest extradition. Meanwhile, Peru, while eager to punish the crime, understood that the UK had already nabbed him. Coordinating 2 legal systems is never simple, but both countries wanted to ensure this man wouldn't evade accountability. The Crown Prosecution Service, CPS, made the decision to proceed with a British trial. Our legislation gave us the jurisdiction to take on the case. although usually the country where the crime was committed would extradite the individual, explained Libby Clark, a senior prosecutor with CPS. Given Jorge's UK connection and his immediate confession, the feeling was that British courts could swiftly deliver justice. Clark noted that the CPS would always consider using those powers under the Domestic Abuse Act, particularly in cases of domestic violence, wherever it might have occurred. This case was a perfect, if tragic, example for that new law. That decision launched what would become a historic trial process. However, taking on the case in Britain introduced significant logistical challenges. All the key evidence, the crime scene, the witnesses, forensic results, were in Peru or elsewhere abroad. The CPS's international division sprang into action, working to gather evidence from Peru, Honduras, and Spain, and to arrange for witness testimony from those locations. Detective Inspector Lee Neals of Kent Police, who led the investigation, later commented on how complex the case was, involving coordination with international police forces and agencies. They had to secure certified translations of documents, arrange video links, and even fly some witnesses to the UK. Peruvian authorities, for their part, cooperated fully. They provided the British prosecution with everything needed: the autopsy report, photographs of the burial site, the blue tarp that served as evidence, samples collected from the scene, and statements from Peruvian officers who recovered the body. Honduran and Spanish authorities also assisted, since Karla's family members there had information to contribute, such as Karla's communications and state of mind before the trip. This cross-border teamwork was remarkable. Legally, Peru still could have asserted its own right to try Jorge, but pragmatically, it allowed the UK to go ahead. The Peruvian prosecutor's office likely realized that the UK trial under the Domestic Abuse Act could achieve a conviction more efficiently. And importantly, if the UK trial failed for any reason, Peru retained the option to prosecute him. Since the crime was on their soil, double jeopardy wouldn't apply across different countries' courts. During the pre-trial months, British investigators continued to build a case. They interviewed people in the UK who knew the couple. One interview was with the landlord of the Dartford flat where Karla and Jorge had lived. The landlord recounted how, upon returning alone on October 4th, Jorge told a lie. He claimed that Karla had decided to stay behind in Spain and that while in Peru, he, Jorge, had been robbed of all his money and ID. This was the story Jorge used to explain Karla's absence and perhaps garner sympathy, all while he quietly cleaned out the apartment. This lie became an important piece of evidence demonstrating Jorge's consciousness of guilt. He was concocting alibis instead of reporting Karla missing. Friends in Dartford also noted that Jorge had acted strangely right after coming back. He had effectively vanished from the area by the time news of Karla's disappearance spread in the community. Meanwhile, an autopsy in Peru, and later a review by a British pathologist, provided damning forensic details. The British pathologist who examined the case emphasized something critical for the jury. Strangulation is not instantaneous. Continuous pressure around the neck for between 15 to 30 seconds is required before a person will lose consciousness, the pathologist explained, and that pressure then has to be continued for at least a minute to cause death. In other words, if someone is strangled to death, it's a prolonged act, not an accident or one punch. This would directly challenge any claim that Karla's death happened in a sudden flurry of self-defense. Moreover, the positioning of the cord on Karla's neck indicated she had been strangled from behind, suggesting she was overpowered by surprise or force. By early 2023, the case was ready for trial. It was slated for Maidstone Crown Court in Kent, a court with the capacity to handle serious criminal cases. The trial was set to begin in the summer, and it garnered significant media attention in both the UK and Peru. Observers realized it would be a landmark trial, the first of its kind under the new domestic abuse law. For Karla's family, it was a chance to see justice done, albeit far from home. They prepared to participate as much as possible. Some would eventually attend via video link, like her brother Eric from Honduras, while others from Spain planned to travel in person. Before the trial, there was one more development. Despite his phone confession, Jorge decided to plead not guilty to murder. When formally arraigned, he denied that he intentionally killed Karla. This meant that a full trial was necessary, and Karla's family would have to endure hearing the painful details of her death in court. Detective Inspector Niels later remarked pointedly, "Despite Goray's initial confession to Karla's family, he pleaded not guilty and instead chose to put her family through the ordeal of a trial, where details were heard that no family should have to listen to." Indeed, the trial would reveal every harrowing aspect of the crime. The courtroom filled with a mix of people from different corners of the world. In the dock sat Jorge Godoy, headphones on as an interpreter quietly translated the proceedings into Spanish for him. Across the court, members of Karla's family watched, some in person, others via video screens from abroad. A jury of 12 Britons took their seats, ready to hear a case that had occurred 6,000 miles away. Mr. Justice Jeremy Johnson presided as the judge, and leading the prosecution was Philip Bennett KC, a seasoned barrister. On the defense team was Edmund Burge KC, representing Jorge. From the outset, Justice Johnson acknowledged the common ground in the case. Jorge admitted he caused Karla's death. The dispute was over intent and circumstances. Essentially, the trial would boil down to whether the jury believed Jorge's claim of self-defense or the prosecution's assertion of murder. The judge instructed the jury that they would need to decide if Jorge was under attack when he killed Karla and whether the force he used was reasonable in self-defense. The burden, of course, lay on the prosecution to prove it was murder and not a justifiable act. In his opening statement, prosecutor Philip Bennett KC methodically laid out the story of Karla and Jorge's ill-fated trip, piece by piece, now backed by evidence. He described how the couple flew out on September 15, 2022, for what was supposed to be a holiday in Peru. He outlined their itinerary, time with Jorge's family and a visit to Machu Picchu. Then he moved to the pivotal events in Lima. Bennett told the jury there was no doubt that this defendant killed his partner Karla Godoy, a blunt statement underscoring the identity of the killer was not in question. What the trial had to examine was why and how he did it. The prosecution's theory of motive came down to one word: jealousy. Bennett painted Jorge as a bullying, controlling and jealous man who resented Karla's relationship with her daughter and her ex-partner. Evidence was presented to support this characterization. For instance, one of Karla's friends from London testified, either in person or via statement, about Jorge's demeanor. There were instances noted where Jorge would become moody or angry when Karla was talking to her daughter on the phone. Karla's brother Eric also gave evidence about Jorge's jealousy, recalling that Jorge is a jealous man and would get furious whenever Karla communicated with her 10-year-old daughter, who lived with her ex. All of this established a pattern of possessiveness. A particularly insightful piece of testimony came from Karla's aunt, Sylvia Meza, who was in Spain. She testified about the phone call with Karla on September 12th, just before Karla and Jorge flew to Peru. In that call, Karla was upset about her ex-husband's threats regarding their daughter. The aunt recounted how Jorge seemed agitated by Karla's distress over her ex. This conversation was important because it gave context. Karla was considering cutting the Peru trip short to return to Spain and deal with the situation involving her daughter. In fact, evidence showed Karla had moved up her return flight to September 24th because she was anxious to reunite with her child and ensure everything was okay. This was a crucial trigger. Bennett argued that Jorge became consumed by jealousy at the prospect of Karla leaving him early to go back to her ex, even if just to see the child. He feared losing control over Karla and resented the hold her past relationship still had on her time and attention. Judge Johnson, in later remarks, echoed this, saying the defendant was indeed consumed by jealousy when he killed Karla. The court heard that between September 21st and October 2nd, 2022, the time frame in which Karla was killed, something in that household erupted into violence. To detail that something, the prosecution walked the jury through the forensic and physical evidence. They showed photos of the shallow grave in the garden, the blue plastic tarp, and the location relative to the house. A Peruvian crime scene officer testified via video link, describing how the body was discovered exactly where Jorge said it would be. The blue tarp Karla was wrapped in was presented as an exhibit, likely shipped from Peru. There were gasps in the courtroom when jurors saw images of the tarp and the burial site. It drove home the cold-blooded steps taken to hide Karla's body after the killing. Next, the medical evidence was discussed. A UK forensic pathologist, who had reviewed Karla's autopsy findings, testified about the cause of death: mechanical asphyxia due to strangulation. The pathologist explained about the cord being wrapped twice around Karla's neck and how significant force and time are required to strangle someone to death. This wasn't a quick defensive act. It was prolonged and deliberate. He likely stated that bruising patterns and other injuries on Karla's body were consistent with a sustained assault, not a single blow. Additionally, Peruvian forensics had noted her wrists showed signs of ligature, indicating she was tied up at some point. There was also evidence of sexual assault and beating, as reported in the Peruvian investigation. While the UK trial may not have focused on sexual assault, since that was not a separate charge being tried, and it's possible the defense would contest those findings, the prosecution did mention that Karla had been tied by the hands and severely beaten in the lead-up to her death. All of this underscored the brutality of the act and negated any notion of an accident. Then came the crucial component: Jorge's own words. The prosecution had the audio, or a transcript, of Jorge's phone confession to Eric. Parts of it were introduced as evidence. Hearing Jorge say, "I killed her," in his own voice must have been powerful. However, since that confession wasn't made to police under caution, it might serve as corroboration rather than the central evidence. Legally, it's an admission, but the defense could attempt to downplay it by saying he was suicidal or misunderstood on the call. More formally, the prosecution highlighted what Jorge told actual police officials. It turns out that Jorge didn't just confess to Eric. He also spoke with a Peruvian police officer on the phone that same day. According to testimony, Jorge called a Peruvian policeman and said, "We had an argument. She wanted to attack me with a knife. I defended myself. I punched her. One punch. I buried her." This was recounted to the court by the policeman, or via the policeman's statement. That quote is a succinct summary of Jorge's excuse. He claims Karla came at him, and he reacted in self-defense, causing her death accidentally with a single hit. Importantly, he admits to burying her, which shows consciousness of guilt. Bennett's likely seized on the discrepancies here. Jorge's claim of one punch did not match the forensic reality of strangulation with a cord, and if it were truly self-defense, why go to the lengths of wrapping the body and hiding it? Now it was the defense's turn to tell Jorge's side of the story. Edmund Burge KC did not dispute that Jorge caused Karla's death. How could he, with all that evidence? Instead, he argued that what happened was an unplanned, tragic fight that got out of control, not murder. The defense's narrative went like this. Yes, the couple argued, they had been under strain due to issues with Karla's ex and her daughter, and both were stressed. On the evening of September 22nd, the likely date of the incident, Karla became mad and angry, as Jorge had described, perhaps because of messages from her ex-partner that upset her. They were sitting in the kitchen of the Caraballo house. Karla told Jorge she'd received more harassing messages from her ex about their daughter. Jorge purportedly responded by telling her to ignore the ex, maybe even saying something harsh to her in the process. In Jorge's own account to police later, he admitted, "I told her to ignore him. I told her she was a expletive." This cruel remark enraged Karla, and she slapped Jorge hard across the face. She shouted that he had no right to tell her what to do with her child, and that he was no one to her in that matter. At this point, by the defense's telling, the confrontation escalated physically. Jorge slapped her back in anger. Then, as Jorge claimed, Karla grabbed a knife. Specifically, he said she seized a wooden-handled kitchen knife from nearby and came at him. In a flash, fearing for his life, Jorge fought back. In his version, there was a struggle, and at some point he struck Karla once with his hand, or perhaps she struck her head when he shoved her, and she fell unconscious. He insisted that he never intended to kill her or cause serious harm. It was, he maintained, a spontaneous act of self-defense gone horribly wrong. Burge emphasized to the jury that nothing in Jorge's past indicated he was violent or had planned to do such a thing. This indeed was true, As far as the court knew, Jorge had no prior criminal record for violence. Burge described the event as completely out of character for Jorge and argued that he was truly remorseful for what happened. He quoted Jorge's regretful words to illustrate that the defendant himself found the outcome as horrible for him as for Karla's family, suggesting that Jorge was haunted by what he'd done. The defense essentially asked the jury to consider a manslaughter verdict, unlawful killing without intent, acknowledging a death occurred at his hands, but denying it was murder. To bolster the self-defense narrative, the defense likely pointed to the chaotic circumstances after the killing rather than the killing itself, which Jorge couldn't plausibly justify. They might have argued, why would Jorge call the police and confess if he had malicious intent? The phone call on October 12th, where he was distraught and suicidal, was used to show his remorse rather than guilt. Burge probably said something akin to, Jorge couldn't live with what happened. That's why he confessed. He also suggested that the couple's fight was not premeditated. There was nothing to suggest he intended that night to end the way it did, Burge told the court. In other words, it wasn't a planned murder, but a heat-of-the-moment confrontation. Of course, the prosecution had a strong rebuttal to all of this. Bennett's questioned why, if it were just a sudden accident, did Jorge tie up Karla's hands, sexually assault her, and strangle her with a cord? The forensic evidence of binding and the nature of her injuries pointed to a sustained attack, not a split-second reaction. The prosecution argued that Jorge's story of a knife attack by Karla was fabricated after the fact to excuse his actions. In fact, British police never found any independent evidence that Karla wielded a knife. No knife was recovered in a way that indicated a struggle. The Peruvian police did find knives in the kitchen, but nothing to support his specific claim. It was essentially his word against the physical evidence. One particularly powerful prosecution point came from those who knew the couple. Multiple witnesses described Jorge's prior behavior toward Karla as bullying and controlling. For instance, a colleague from the cleaning company testified that on one occasion, Karla had been anxious because Jorge didn't like her going out with friends. Another witness, possibly a neighbor, recalled hearing heated arguments from the Dartford flat, where Jorge would shout at Karla, though those incidents hadn't been reported at the time. All these anecdotes painted a consistent picture aligning with the prosecution's portrayal of Jorge's character. As Libby Clark of the CPS summed up, the evidence from those who witnessed his behavior towards her suggested he was a bullying, controlling, and jealous man. The jury saw through those lies. Indeed, that statement was given after the verdict, but it encapsulates what the prosecution wanted the jury to conclude, that Jorge's self-defense story was a lie. Interestingly, Jorge himself did not testify at the trial. He chose to remain silent and let his lawyers present his account indirectly through his prior statements. This meant he did not subject himself to cross-examination. The jury could take that as they wished. They were instructed not to hold it against him, as is his right. But sometimes jurors wonder why a person wouldn't tell their story under oath if it were true. The defense likely felt that his broken English, or the weight of cross-examination on the inconsistencies in his narrative, might do more harm than good. Over the course of the trial, which lasted several weeks in July 2023, the jurors were presented with all of this testimony, evidence, and argumentation. They saw photos from happier times, the smiling selfies of Karla and Jorge at Machu Picchu, alongside the stark images of the shallow grave. They heard from Karla's mother, who in a trembling voice over video link recounted how she waited for her daughter at the airport in Spain in vain, her heartbreak palpable. They listened to Eric's anguished account of receiving that phone confession from Jorge. The emotional weight in the courtroom was heavy, especially on Karla's side of the aisle. Meanwhile, Jorge sat mostly expressionless, occasionally bowing his head. Through the interpreter, he heard every witness describe his controlling ways and every forensic detail that contradicted his version of events. Finally, in late July, both sides delivered closing arguments, and the judge gave detailed legal directions. The jury retired and began deliberation. They spent 7 hours examining the evidence and discussing among themselves. It appears they methodically went over everything, but ultimately, the evidence was overwhelming. On July 17, 2023, the jury filed back into the courtroom. When asked for their verdict, they delivered it firmly and unanimously, guilty of murder. The conviction of Jorge Garay for the murder of Karla Godoy was a milestone. At the announcement of the verdict, a ripple of emotion moved through the room. Karla's relatives, watching from abroad, broke down in tears of relief and sorrow. In Maidstone Crown Court, a quiet gasp was heard from Karla's supporters, followed by soft cries. Jorge Garay, on the other hand, stared downward. He had little visible reaction as he absorbed the reality that he had been found guilty of murder, a verdict that carries a mandatory life sentence in the UK. On July 28, 2023, a couple of weeks after the verdict, the court reconvened for sentencing. By now the outcome was clear, but this hearing allowed the judge to address the gravity of the offence and for the family to voice their loss. Mr. Justice Jeremy Johnson delivered the sentence with sombre gravity. He summarised the case, highlighting how Jorge had viciously betrayed the woman who trusted him. Karla had travelled across the world with him, only for him to take her life and bury her in his family's backyard. The judge noted that Jorge was consumed by jealousy when he committed the murder, echoing the trial evidence that jealousy was the motive. There was a moment where Justice Johnson directly addressed Jorge about the devastating impact of his actions, how he had not only ended Karla's life, but also left a little girl motherless and a family forever grieving. Jorge, clad in prison-issue clothing, stood motionless as he received his sentence. Life imprisonment was pronounced, which in the UK means he will remain in custody indefinitely, subject to a minimum term. Judge Johnson set a minimum term of 17 years to serve before Jorge can even be considered for release. This means Jorge will be in his 60s at least by the time he could potentially walk free, and only if a parole board decides he is no longer a risk. Effectively, for the next 17 years, and likely longer, he will remain behind bars. Given the heinous details of the crime, many felt 17 years as a minimum was not overly harsh. Some even thought it lenient, considering the premeditation evidenced by the burial. However, 17 years was likely calculated by the judge after considering factors like the confession, which albeit retracted showed some remorse, and the lack of previous convictions. In the UK system, a 17-year minimum for a domestic murder is within typical range, though some cases with sexual assault or body concealment might get slightly more. The family perhaps took solace that it was life and not a fixed term, meaning Jorge cannot just walk out automatically after serving those years. He must prove he is not a danger, and the sentence can keep him for life if needed. During sentencing, Karla's family was given a voice through victim impact statements. Eric Zelaya's statement was read aloud. On video link from Honduras, Eric expressed the immeasurable pain of losing his dear sister. "When I lost my sister, I lost a part of me," he wrote in his letter to the court. He described Karla as not just a sister, but his confidant and best friend, someone full of life who had a generous, adventurous spirit. He spoke of the void in their family gatherings, the trauma that haunts their elderly mother, and the young daughter who will grow up without her mum. Other family members from Spain also provided statements or watched on quietly. Karla's mother, too overcome to speak live, had her words conveyed through a prosecutor. She conveyed a mother's anguish, how no parent should ever have to bury their child, and how she still wakes up some days expecting a call from Karla that never comes. Jorge did not address the court in person at sentencing. Defendants sometimes choose to speak, but presumably he did not, or if he did, it was brief and not reported. Through his lawyer, however, it was said that he maintains his remorse and accepts responsibility for causing Karla's death, while still insisting it was not murder. These lukewarm expressions did little to sway anyone. The judge was unsparing. He pointed out that Jorge's actions after the crime, hiding the body, lying to the landlord, were not the actions of a truly remorseful man in the immediate aftermath. One especially poignant part of the sentencing was hearing about Karla's daughter. The little girl was 8 years old when her mother went on that fateful trip. She is now being raised by her father, Karla's ex, and close relatives. In her impact statement, Karla's mother said that explaining to the child that her mommy wasn't coming back was the hardest thing they've ever had to do. Karla's former employer, who had organized a fundraiser, also submitted a tribute describing how loved Karla was by colleagues and friends in London, and how the company was helping support the daughter financially. This underlined the broad ripple of grief, spanning from Central America to Europe, caused by Karla's death. Outside the courtroom, Detective Inspector Lee Niels gave a public statement reflecting on the case. His words mirrored what he had said in the press release. Karla Godoy's life was violently cut short by a man she trusted during what was supposed to be a holiday for the couple. Gray's actions not only ended her life, but he tried to cover up his crimes by callously disposing of her body. He highlighted the tragedy of Karla's daughter being left without a mother, and he commended the international cooperation that helped secure the conviction. There was also a sentiment of holding this case up as an example that abusers cannot escape justice by committing crimes abroad. Niels thanked the Peruvian authorities and the CPS International Division for their tireless work. Libby Clark from CPS Southeast, the prosecutor, also spoke to the media after sentencing. She reiterated that Jorge's self-defense claim was a transparent falsehood that the jury rightly rejected. Clark underscored how significant it was that the Domestic Abuse Act 2021 had been used successfully. This case presented many challenges, but our legislation allowed us to take it on. We will always consider using these powers in cases of domestic violence, wherever it might have occurred. The successful conviction in this highly unusual case potentially opened the door for future prosecutions of similar crimes. Indeed, Jorge Godoy became the first person in the UK to be convicted of a crime committed abroad under this new domestic abuse law. This case thus set a legal precedent. Advocacy groups and legal commentators noted that this could encourage more cross-border justice for victims of abuse. It sends a strong message that if a UK resident thinks they can evade law enforcement by taking a partner overseas and harming them, they are wrong. The long arm of UK law can and will reach across borders in such instances. Back in Peru, the outcome of the trial was closely followed. Peruvian news outlets reported on the conviction and sentence, emphasizing the cadena perpetua, life sentence, handed down to the Peruvian who murdered and buried his Honduran partner. There was a sense of vindication that the man was punished, even if in a foreign court. Some Peruvian commentators pointed out that had Jorge been tried in Peru, he likely would have faced a similarly harsh penalty for aggravated femicide, potentially life imprisonment as well, given the premeditation and concealment. They saw the British trial as justice served, and also as a reflection of Peru's own struggle, that yet another woman's life was taken by machismo and jealousy. The case fueled ongoing discussions in Peru about femicide and the importance of early warning signs in abusive relationships. Many wondered if more could have been done to protect Karla, but given that she was not known to Peruvian authorities until after she was missing, it was a tragic situation that unfolded suddenly. In London and among Karla's circle of friends, the verdict and sentencing brought some measure of closure. Her close friend, the one who had alerted everyone when Jorge cleaned out the flat, spoke to a local newspaper saying, "We still feel her loss every day, but we're grateful the truth came out and he's been held responsible. Karla was such a beautiful soul, and now there's justice for her." There was talk of holding a memorial service for Karla in London, since many who loved her in the UK didn't get to attend her funeral. Her body was repatriated to Honduras after forensic examinations, and she was laid to rest there by her family in late 2022. As for Karla's young daughter, family friends say she is surrounded by loving relatives, and they have gently told her that her mother is now in heaven. The little girl wrote a letter to her mom that her grandmother keeps. In it, she says she misses her, and that she's keeping up with her schoolwork because "Mommy told me to always do my best." It's an innocent child's way of coping with an immeasurable loss. The murder of Karla Godoy stands as a sorrowful example of domestic violence taken to the extreme. It began as a story of an adventurous trip and a chance for love and family bonding, and it ended with an act of horrific violence fueled by jealousy. But the story did not conclude with her death. It continued on to become a story about international cooperation and the relentless pursuit of justice without borders. In the end, Jorge Garay will spend at least the next 17 years in prison contemplating the life he stole and the lives he shattered. Karla's family will forever mourn her, but they can take some comfort in knowing that her killer did not escape responsibility. In a broader sense, this case leaves a lasting impact on how such crimes can be addressed. It has shown that when it comes to seeking justice for victims of domestic abuse, distance and borders need not shield the guilty. The successful conviction under the Domestic Abuse Act's extraterritorial provision may well be Karla's legacy in the legal world, potentially safeguarding future victims by deterring abusers from thinking they can hide behind jurisdictional walls. Yet beyond the legal ramifications, we remember Karla as a vibrant woman whose life was cut short. Her story is a poignant reminder of the dangers of intimate partner violence and the importance of recognizing warning signs. It is also a story of a family's love and determination. They moved heaven and earth to find her and ensure the man who harmed her faced justice. Thank you so much for listening. As a new podcast, we very much appreciate your support. If you're interested in rarely heard global murder cases like this one, we encourage you to give us a follow, or even rate us 5 stars on your podcast app. If we may be so bold, it would help us out a lot. See you next time.